All right, welcome back. We are in part 30 of Where Did the Book of Mormon Come From? And I really appreciate you being with us today, and it's certainly a blessing. And once again, we want to continue to go through some of these things because I think they're very important. And so that's what we're going to do. So we're on First Nephi, and we're looking at the small plates. So Grant Hardy says in his introduction to the Book of Mormon, he says, after Joseph and his scribe Martin Harris had translated 116 pages of Mormon's abridgment of the large plates, Martin asked for and received permission to take the manuscript home to show his skeptical wife. The manuscript was stolen, and Joseph was commanded not to retranslate the lost pages, but rather to translate the small plates of Nephi in its stead. Latter-day Saints, following hints in the Book of Mormon itself, interpret this as an example of God's foreknowledge. Well, interesting enough, maybe as a case, they had to come up with another plan, is what happened here, as we'll discuss, as a better explanation. Because, like I'll say again, and I've already said this from Jeremiah chapter 36, you'll remember that what Jeremiah had written through Baruch the scribe to the king, and what did Jehoiakim do with the scroll? He cut it up and he burned it in the fire. Well, did that cause any distraught with Jeremiah or Baruch? No, friends. In fact, God actually uh, said to Jeremiah, "You're going to write it again, and this time you're going to actually add more to it." So, you know, that's something for us to think about here. Latter-day Saints, following hints in the Book of Mormon itself, critics since Von Brody have seen this incident much less providentially as a personal crisis that became a pivotal moment in Joseph's progression from village seer to prophet. And I would agree with that. In either case, the basic structure of the Book of Mormon is as follows. Small plates of Nephi, which covers First Nephi through Omni, 150 pages. Mormon's explanatory comments, which were the words of Mormon, 2 pages. Mormon's abridgment of the large plates of Nephi, Mosiah through chapter 7 of Mormon, 380 pages. Moroni's additions to his father's records, chapter 8 of Mormon through Moroni, 50 pages. It appears after the loss of the first part of the manuscript, Joseph continued his dictation with the book of Mosiah, worked his way to the end of Moroni, and then produced 1st and 2nd Nephi, the books that now stand at the beginning of the text. This means that the Book of Mormon narrative was produced out of chronological order, with words of Mormon being the last section dictated. So you see, what LDS scholars, and we agree that Smith actually started beginning with Mosiah and worked his way toward the end of Moroni. Of course, you've seen how I've shown you the restructuring that Rigdon had to do. And then they had to restart with 1st and 2nd Nephi through the words of Mormon. So Rigdon had come to the rescue by taking the manuscript home and re-editing it by adding theological truths to it from Helaman to possibly either Ether or Moroni. Because of the crisis, there was a huge vacuum that needed to be filled where 1st Nephi through Words of Mormon are located today. It was important to replace them in some way after editing Helaman through Ether or Moroni. Some of the storyline of what is known as 1st Nephi remained intact. We know this because we have the testimony of Henry Lake, who stated he remembered the story of Laban, which is still there in 1st Nephi 3 through 7. And the grammatical inconsistency remains there that had not been corrected. It could also have been the case that possibly Rigdon still had an unedited manuscript of Spalding that he could return to that contained that account as a possibility. There was a storyline between Lehi's family to the appearance of King Benjamin that needed to be replaced, and there are several points that needed to be made so that Rigdon could keep the consistency of the storyline intact. First, Rigdon should not mention very many geographical places, cities, names, directions, etc. He must keep the storyline as simple and vague of detail as possible. And we see this is the case in regards to 1st Nephi through Words of Mormon when a person examines these books very closely. In fact, the best cure for Rigdon is to invent sermonic material so that he does not have to deal with matters of historical narrative. And we see this in 1st Nephi and 2nd Nephi, and of course the other small books. And if you examine the chapters I have placed in blue, it either has to do with theological material, sermons, so-called prophecies, or the purpose of creating 2 sets of plates. And as you can see, it is in the blue sections where most of the scripture references from the Bible are located. So let's look at some of these. I want to make this a little bit bigger for you so you can kind of see what I'm talking about. All right, so you notice this red part up here. And it does seem to be the case that probably 1st Nephi 1 through 5 most likely is a lot from Spalding still that was not destroyed. And and maybe it is possible that Spalding did draw from the Bible a little bit, and that's why you have those scriptural references. But it's also possible that Rigdon edited it and added those scriptures into it. And then what's interesting to me is here we got 1st Nephi chapter 6. Nephi writes to persuade men to come unto God, the mentioning of the small plates. So that to me is where it's the case where they had to come up with a plan. So when Rigdon was re-editing the manuscript, he had to add these parts where he's talking about the small plates. And then later on, Mormon, he's working on his abridgment, and all of a sudden, he comes across the small plates of Nephi. Anyway, so. And then in 1st Nephi 7, Lehi's sons return to Jerusalem and get Ishmael and his family. And then probably chapter 8, 9, 10, 11. Look at chapter 9. Nephi explains he is making 2 sets of plates. He doesn't want you to forget that. But if you can see, this vision that Lehi sees, I can't remember if it was Lehi or Nephi. I may have been wrong about this. Sorry, I may have made this wrong. I need to go back and look at that. It's either Lehi or Nephi, who maybe it was Nephi who wrote down the vision of Lehi. I don't remember exactly. I need to look back at this, and I'm very sorry. I apologize. So what's interesting to me is we see that there is this structure of the book of Revelation for a lot of this, I think. So that's why I find very interesting. So you can see why it is the case that Rigdon did not have to write about the historical narrative. That's why he writes about prophecy, so to speak. He writes about visions, because you don't have to be exactly consistent in a historical narrative, so to speak. So notice this runs all the way to 1st Nephi chapter 15. And then you go to 1st Nephi chapter 16, 17, and 18. Probably, maybe Spalding material. It's possible. I'm not exactly certain. And then you have 1st Nephi 16 through 18, which I don't think was destroyed. I think that's part of Spalding's writings. And notice 1st Nephi 19. There's the 2 sets of plates mentioned again. And then what's interesting is that they quote from Isaiah 48, Isaiah 49, just putting filler material into it, my friends. And then 1st Nephi 22, you'll see that there. All right. Now, second, Rigdon must be able to connect the storyline from Lehi's family to King Benjamin, which is about a time span of 500 years. So 600 BC to 120 BC, so around there. Third, Rigdon must be able to explain why it's the case that there are 2 sets of plates, and why there's one set that's secular and why there's one set that is more spiritual. And what's interesting to me is, okay, you got Mormon writing this abridgment, and he's writing about supposedly the secular, right? Why would he not be writing more about the spiritual in the first place? But then, so he's writing about secular, and then he discovers the small plates, and he says, well, you know what? I actually want to put in the spiritual stuff. So then Rigdon has to have Mormon discover the small plates of Nephi, so that Mormon will include an abridged record of them in his records. And look at how these 2 sets of plates are mentioned from 1st Nephi to Omni. And there I mentioned these references here you can look at for yourself. 1st Nephi, 2nd Nephi, Jacob, Jerome, Omni, Words of Mormon. But and what's intriguing is what you find after this, in that you don't find any mention of the small plates. Is that not interesting? You can read about the plates of Nephi, but you don't read about the small plates. Now, I most likely did not get all the references to the plates that were to make up the Book of Mormon, but I also went to the LDS website to try to look up where all the references to the small plates of Nephi were. And from all the information gathered, it does seem the case that First Nephi, through words of Mormon, are aware of the mentioning of the small plates are located. And this fits our hypothetical model. Though that if Rigdon and company came up with a small plates of Nephi idea after the loss of the 116 pages, then we're bound to only find the small plates mentioned in the places where they are being passed down, and they won't be mentioned in the Book of Mosiah and onward. All right, and then the comment I want to make about I Nephi. Remember that some of the witnesses read manuscript found, and I know we only have one who said Artemis Cunningham, who, well, several of them refer to one of the main characters, Nephi and Lehi, like John Spalding, Oliver Smith, and John Miller. But there was Artemis Cunningham who remembered that reoccurring statement, I Nephi. Remember what he says? I'll just read the part there in bold. The frequent repetition of the phrase I Nephi I recollect as distinctly as though it was but yesterday, although the general features of the story have passed from my memory through the lapse of 22 years. And like we've said before, this I Nephi phrase is found 84 times in 1st Nephi and then in 2nd Nephi. 24, except for one time in Helaman, sorry. So 23 times in 2nd Nephi. One of the most unusual statements that Nephi, a Jew, is making is a record in the language of my father, which consists of the learning of the Jews in the language of the Egyptians. Now, that to me, right out of the gate, is very odd and it's very improbable that Lehi, Nephi's father, he lived in Jerusalem all the days of his life, and he has known the language of Hebrew. And why would Nephi want to compose this record in Reformed Egyptian, my friends? Why would he not desire to compose it in Hebrew, his mother language? To show how absurd this idea of a Jew writing in Reformed Egyptian is, and we don't even know what Reformed Egyptian really means, actually. The Bible is written in 3 languages, Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. Primarily, the Old Testament was written in Hebrew because that was the language that the Israelites' native tongue was, and thus God communicated through his prophets to them in that language. Now, it's interesting in the book of Daniel and the book of Ezra. Daniel 2:4 through the end of chapter 7, it's written in Aramaic, while the bookends are written in Hebrew. So why is that the case? Well, some people have tried to struggle to understand why Daniel was written this way. Well, this Aramaic from chapter 2, verse 4 to the end of chapter 7, it's known as Imperial Aramaic, and it was known as a common language at that time. And it was in the 6th century BC, friends. And so that's really interesting to me because Daniel 2-4 to the end of chapter 7 is about those 4 kingdoms. You remember that Daniel had a vision, Daniel interpreted the dream of Nebuchadnezzar, and we see that he saw this big statue, and it was Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, and Rome. And so I think that's interesting. And the target language and audience would be exactly right if Gentiles who desired to read Daniel, they would want to know about Daniel's prophecies concerning them. They could read that portion if they wanted to. But it's interesting, the bookends that contain the Hebrew language is actually targeted toward the Jews, and they would have wanted to know the events and prophecies concerning their nation. So it makes sense why Daniel was written in those 2 languages. And in the New Testament, why was it written in Greek? Why was it written in Koine Greek? Because by that time, Greek was the common language at that time. There were 3 centuries before that, Alexander the Great had invaded the whole world, and he spread Hellenistic culture and the Greek language. So it would help the gospel to launch and to spread on a grander scale because it was for an international audience. So the Bible makes perfect sense when it's written in Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. But in regards to the Book of Mormon, does it make any sense why Nephi, a Jew, would want to write Egyptian to his Jewish posterity? It just doesn't make sense, my friends. For it came to pass, this is the first came to pass statement that's found in the Book of Mormon, and the phrase is found many times. First Nephi chapter 1, verse 4, you'll see it there the first time. In fact, a whole lot more than you think, especially if you were to read the 1830 edition, which they've actually removed come to pass phrases a lot from the 1830 edition. Some of the eyewitnesses who had read Spalding's manuscript, like John and Martha and Henry Lake, claimed they read that phrase frequently throughout his writings. Some of his friends and neighbors gave Solomon Spalding the nickname "Oh, come to pass" due to him using it so much. Look at Abner Jackson, what he says again. Spalding frequently read his manuscript to the neighbors and amused them as he progressed with his work. He wrote it in a Bible style, and it came to pass occurred so often that some called him "Oh, come to pass." When it was brought to Conuet and read there in public, old Esquire Wright heard it and exclaimed, "Oh, come to pass has come to life again." Interesting enough, I want to read you what Mark Twain wrote about the Book of Mormon. So he writes this at the beginning of his book, Roughing It. The book seems to be merely a prosy detail of imaginary history, with the Old Testament for a model, followed by a tedious plagiarism of the New Testament. And he's right. The author labored to give his words and phrases the quaint, old-fashioned sound and structure of our King James translation of the Scriptures, and the result is a mongrel, half-modern glibness and half-ancient simplicity and gravity. The latter is awkward and constrained, the former natural but grotesque by the contrast. Whenever he found his speech growing too modern, which was about every sentence or two, he ladled in a few such scriptural phrases as "exceeding sore," and "it came to pass," etc., and made things satisfactory again. And "it came to pass" was his pet. If he had left that out, his Bible would have been only a pamphlet. Now, I know he's exaggerating there, but what's interesting is Mark Twain did call the Book of Mormon chloroform in print. So I always found that kind of interesting. We read this already, what Calgary said. If it's okay with you, we've already gone over that part, so what I'll do is I can stop it and you can read it for yourself if you wish to read it again. All right. Hardy then states, the Book of Mormon, it is written in a somewhat awkward, repetitious form of English. Nearly every page contains examples of archaic English constructions, phrases that reappear several times in quick succession, and locutions such as "and it came to pass." And for behold, that are annoyingly pervasive. I mean, this is an LES scholar saying that. Annoyingly pervasive. Indeed, the constant refrain of "and it came to pass" was so offensive to Gallic sensibilities that the French translation for many decades replaced the phrase with an asterisk wherever it appeared. Similarly, much of the grammar was awkward in the original edition, and despite several thousand minor revisions, he admits there was lots of revisions to the 1830 edition. For example, "is" to "are," "them," which to "those who," and "had fell" to "that had fallen." There are still sentence fragments, misplaced prepositional phrases, pronouns with unclear antecedents, and verses in which the subject changes mid-sentence. And yet, what did Joseph Smith say? This is the most correct book on earth. All right, 1 Nephi 3:3. Another unusual and probable statement is that Laban holds in his possession the genealogical lists of Lehi's forefathers that are written on plates of brass. Why would Lehi not know his own genealogy prior to this time? Were not genealogical lists important to the Jews? And we see this, that the Jews kept very good chronological records, as we see in 1 Chronicles 1-9, Ezra 2, Nehemiah 7, Matthew 1, Luke 3. I thought Brother Wayne Jackson has something good. He had a good article on the importance of Messianic genealogy. And it says it would be important in regards to establishing the genealogical line of the Messiah. The priests were to show that they descended from the tribe of Levi and the property rights of the Jews. Jackson wrote, R.K. Harrison observed that records of the descent were an extremely important part of Hebrew tradition from the very beginning. Noted scholar Joachim Jeremias has discussed at length the necessity of preserving the genealogical heritage of the post-exile Jews. Note the following. Number 1, in view of a special lineage that Jehovah had chosen, through whom the promised Messiah would descend, the Hebrews were prohibited from contracting marriages with Gentiles, though there were rare exceptions, Ruth, Rahab, Bathsheba. Due to Israel's dispersal among the nations, Jews who made pilgrimages back to Jerusalem and wished to marry were required to have the genealogy of their future wife checked according to the requirements. How could this be if no written records were available? Number two, under the Old Testament law, the offices of the priests and Levites were hereditary. This position could be attained in no other way than by inheritance. It was extremely important, therefore, that the purity of the line remained intact. Accordingly, great care was taken in tracing genealogy. If a priest could not prove his legitimate descent, he lost his rights to priestly office, and both for himself and for his descendants, and also to priestly revenues. Induction into the priesthood was not a matter of orality alone. Number three, during the time of Christ's earthly sojourn, certain families of Hebrew nobility were granted the privilege of carrying wood to the temple on certain days. This fact shows that the genealogical tradition was well preserved among the lay nobility. An Israelite woman who wished to marry into a priest's family had to produce her genealogy for 5 generations. Property rights. When the Hebrews conquered the territory on the eastern side of the Jordan River, and then likewise that between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, by divine edict they were assigned various tribal allotments. Reuben, Gad, and the half tribe of Manasseh, settled east of the Jordan, Numbers 32. After the initial victories to the west, Judah, Ephraim, and the other half tribe of Manasseh were given their regions, Joshua 15 through 17. Finally, after considerable delay, the remaining tribes by lot received their portions of the land, Joshua 18 through 19, with the Levites receiving priestly cities. Years passed, and a gradual apostasy from the faith by Israel resulted. As a divine judgment, the entire land eventually was ravaged by foreigners. Assyria conquered the northern kingdom of Israel. According to Assyrian records, 27,290 souls were taken into captivity, never to return as a body of people. Judah in the south progressively degenerated spiritually until finally, after 3 invasions between 606 and 536, some 70,000 Hebrews were taken to Babylon as captives, where they were to remain for 70 years. I think that was to, I'm pretty sure 606 through 586 is what was meant there. But anyway, so finally, beginning with the reign of Cyrus the Persian, who had conquered Babylon, the Jews, some 125,000 strong by then, were permitted to return to Canaan. Many of their ancestors were now gone into Assyria, Egypt, and various other places. In the return to Canaan, the problem was this: who should inherit what land assignment? How could any Jew prove his right to a certain property inheritance? Was such to be accomplished by verbal jousting? Did one person say so trump another's contention? How might a Jew prove his right to settle in a certain tribal territory if there were no genealogical documents to establish his ancestral history? So I thought that was really good. In fact, we have a good example of this in the Bible. So you remember in 1 Kings 21, you remember King Ahab, and there was Naboth the Jezreelite. Ahab wanted to have Naboth's vineyard, was willing to pay for it. And Naboth replied in 1 Kings 21:3, but Naboth said to Ahab, "The Lord forbid that I should give the inheritance of my fathers to you." Naboth was not going to sell. By implication, Naboth could back up his rights to the vineyard because of the written genealogical records that were available at the time. It seems so very odd and improbable a Jew such as Lehi, who lived all of his life in Jerusalem, did not know his own genealogy. And this is another question that needs to be answered, because this shows the inconsistency of the Book of Mormon. How did he know the land of inheritance that belonged to him was his land if he did not know his genealogy? Now, we first come across what I call the non-sporting person, which I think was probably Sidney Rigdon. Some of the eyewitnesses, such as John Spalding, who heard Spalding's manuscript, stated that it did not contain religious material in it, meaning scriptures, theological content, like that. So what that statement should be interpreted to mean is that there are several distinct sections with a heavy religious overtone that contain quotations or allusions from both the Old and New Testament, being used as sermonic material. The first suspicion is because it's taken from Acts 3:21, which was written in the 1st century AD. First Nephi was supposedly written around 600 years before Jesus was born. So look at what 1 Nephi 3:20 says. "And also that we may preserve unto them the words which have been spoken by the mouth of all the holy prophets, which have been delivered unto them by the Spirit and power of God since the world began." even down unto this present time. And what's interesting to me is let's just remove that text for a moment and let's read it. I think it's kind of interesting. For behold, they have rejected the words of the prophets. Wherefore, if my father should dwell in the land after that he had been commanded to flee out of the land, behold, he would also perish. Wherefore, it must needs be that he flee out of the land. And behold, it is wisdom in God that we should obtain these records, that we might preserve unto our children the language of our fathers. And it came to pass after this manner of language that I persuade my brethren, that they might be faithful in keeping the commandments of God. And it came to pass that we went down to the land of our inheritance. We did gather our gold and our silver and our precious things. And after that we gathered these things together, he went up again unto the house of Laban. So you see, is that removal of text, um, do we actually need that? See, that's why I think it was possibly added. Again, another unusual statement is that the law of Moses had been engraved on numerous plates of brass. Now, if this is taken to mean the Pentateuch, the first 5 books, can you imagine what these plates of brass must have weighed in order to incorporate all the words of the law of Moses on these plates? My case is not against the material it was written on, but the number of plates needed for such a monumental task, and also in regards to carrying around. Let's read this. Read what 1 Nephi 5:10-16 says. It reads, And after they had given thanks unto the God of Israel, my father Lehi took the records which were engraven on the plates of brass, and he did search them from the beginning. And beheld, they did contain the 5 books of Moses, which gave an account of the creation of the world, and also of Adam and Eve, who were our first parents. Also a record of the Jews from the beginning, even down to the commencement of the reign of Zedekiah, king of Judah, which would be, 2 Kings, right? So Genesis through what we call 2 Kings. And also the prophecies of the holy prophets from the beginning, even down to the commencement of the reign of Zedekiah. And also many prophecies which had been spoken by the mouth of Jeremiah. And it came to pass that my father Lehi also found upon the plates of brass a genealogy of his fathers. Wherefore he knew that he was a descendant of Joseph, yea, even that Joseph, who was the son of Jacob, who was sown into Egypt, who was preserved by the hand of the Lord, that he might preserve his father Jacob and all his household from perishing with famine. So, friend, that would be a lot of material written on plates of brass. And then 1 Nephi 4:26, we see this unusual statement where Nephi says, And he, supposing that I spake of the brethren of the church. Using that word church, it just creates suspicion. The Lord's church was not created until the day of Pentecost. So what exactly does Nephi mean by this statement, church? Remember, Jesus had said in Matthew 16:18, Upon this rock I will build my church. So it had not been built prior to that time. So what exactly does Nephi mean by the church? And then you have the problem when you go through the book of Mosiah, and they're building the church before it's even begun in Acts chapter 2. So that's a major problems with the Book of Mormon. Clark Braden says, I want to call the reader's attention to a single coincidence here. Mr. Lake, Spalding's partner, testifies that when Spalding read to him his romance, Mormon Manuscript Number 1, he pointed out an inconsistency in the story of Laban which Spalding promised to correct. But the same blunder is in the Book of Mormon. That can be explained. Spalding no doubt did correct it in the manuscript prepared for the press, but when Mrs. Harris destroyed the 118 pages, or 116 pages, Rigdon had to restore the stolen portion from an older manuscript, in which the blunder had not been corrected. Hence, we have it in the Book of Mormon. It took Rigdon some months to remodel another manuscript to replace the stolen portion, and translation did not begin till the next June, or the 3. Joseph says it began in March. So the plot gets more interesting, right, as Nephi and the rest of his sons were able to acquire those genealogical plates of brass that were in Laban's hands, and to show their father what tribe he descended from, which was, as he said, a descendant of Joseph, the one that's in the book of Genesis. Now we find out later more details that he comes from Joseph's son Manasseh, Alma 10 verse 3. But this poses a huge problem for the Book of Mormon, for they say they're following the commandments of the law of Moses, but they're disobedient because they're using a priesthood from an unauthorized tribe, when the law of Moses taught the authorized tribe for the priesthood was the tribe of Levi. We see this in 2 Chronicles 26. We see this in Hebrews 7:14. And you will see the same blunder in 2 Nephi 5:26. It says, And it came to pass that I, Nephi, did consecrate Jacob and Joseph, that they should be priests and teachers over the land of my people. Well, how could Jacob and Joseph from the tribe of Manasseh be ordained priests if they were not from the authorized priesthood of Israel, Levi? And we see 2 Chronicles 26, where Uzziah trespassed against God because he, not being a son of Aaron, was not authorized to burn incense. Alexander Campbell, I believe, has when he wrote his critique of the Book of Mormon in 1831, and I mean, honestly, the Book of Mormon should have never got the traction that it did. Um, we are 30 minutes past, so we're going to continue this next time. So I really appreciate you being with us. I'll come back in just a few minutes. Thank you for watching.